3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability uniquely.
Without a heritage, every generation starts over.
To remind the current regime.
What your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
To get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
As you all know, we at the Heritage Foundation are big fans of the podcast medium. Podcasts allow us to reach a wide audience with a deep dive into topics that Americans care about. When it comes to public policy, the variety of those topics can be endless. But one that we're going to talk about today actually goes beyond any single policy. The question of how things actually get done in Washington, how the sausage actually gets made. So we are very excited that our partners at the Daily Signal have recently released a new podcast, The Signal Sit Down, hosted by politics reporter Bradley Devlin. In the show, Bradley sits down with movers and shakers in Washington who are willing to take him behind the scenes on how policy comes about in our nation's capital. And so, I sat down with Bradley to give our listeners on Heritage Explains a little bit of that same perspective. Bradley Devlin, welcome to Heritage Explains.
Thank you for having me.
So, your new show for the Daily Signal just launched. Very exciting. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're the politics reporter for the Daily Signal. Why politics?
Why politics? I started off growing up in Southern California, interested in a whole lot of different and weird things. And politics kind of represents the convergence of being able to affect change in a variety of areas, right? Like I was really passionate about conserving the good things about our public lands, right? The flora, the fauna, the natural splendor that only America can offer. I was passionate about American history. I was passionate about law, thought I might sell my soul and become a lawyer at some point. And through that, you kind of realize that politics, for good or for bad, has a impact on all those different areas of interest for me. And so I decided to start to get involved in politics when I was 15, 16 years old. And from there, after graduating college, I didn't have any other skills other than yelling what I thought on social media. So I naturally ended up in journalism. And so from there, it's been a really fun ride to, you learn about all of the different ideas in school, whether that's Econ 101 or the basics of foreign relations or how a healthcare system ought to operate. You learn all those things in school. The policy process in Washington, D.C. looks way different than the ideal scenario. Why? Because you're dealing with the political realities that are in front of you. And for all those great ideas, there's structures, interests, factions, as Madison once wrote in the Federalist Papers, that aren't necessarily pleased with the ideal. They're pleased with systems and structures that advantage them. And so revealing how that policy process happens, whether that's appropriations, whether that's supplemental funding for foreign wars, whether that's the NDAA, whether that's, various regulations that come down and get published in the registrar, like that's the policy conversation that I think the American people are often left out of.
So your new show, The Signal Sit Down, it's all about how the sausage actually gets made. What are some of the things that you have learned on the journey you've been on so far that you can kind of whet people's appetite with? Yeah,
well, as I say, you graduate from college or you learn about all these various issue areas, and then all of a sudden you come to DC and you realize, oh my gosh, I didn't know that the Rules Committee had such an outsized impact. I didn't know that our appropriations process hasn't gone through committees in forever because we punt everything to a giant omnibus. I didn't know that, the motion to vacate or the filibuster or any of these various parliamentary procedures in Congress are so essential to how the the Congress actually operates, how these respective legislatures actually operate, and what are the political incentives to, operate under one legislative strategy with this climate versus operate with another legislative strategy under another climate, right? Does Kevin McCarthy go forward with some of the deals that he brokered with Joe Biden on the debt ceiling fight if he's faced with an even more rambunctious right flank? He went forward with it knowing that he could have been vacated ultimately over this type of deal. And yet he still went forward with it anyway. So if there were more conservative concessions, would that have staved off a debt ceiling deal that took the national debt off of the election topics? I know we talk a lot about government deficits and the debt still, but when it's a live issue that needs to be solved fairly soon after the upcoming election, right, that changes the electoral incentives at play. As for like the broader journey, I mean, yeah, it's wild to see how far we've gone down the rabbit hole. Oftentimes you send people to Washington and you think that they're debating other members and that those members are acting in good faith. Well, that's just frankly not really the case. A lot of what is voted on, sadly, in Congress is negotiated, right? The big stuff that they vote on, appropriations, namely, it's all negotiated in a smoke-filled room with 3 or 4 different major players, right? The Speaker of the House Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader. And from that conversation with those individuals and their staffs, they drop 1,000+ pages of legislation on, your hometown member of Congress's desk and expect them to vote on that package within 36 hours. No one can read a piece of legislation that quickly by themselves, and no one can actually, get down to the brass tacks of where our money's actually going in that process.
So your first episode was last week with Senator Ron Johnson. What did you take away from that interview?
Senator Ron Johnson is probably one of my favorite people in Washington, D.C. to talk to. And that's why he was my first episode, because every single time I talk to him, he gives me another story. He gives me another fascinating insight into exactly what we've been talking about, into how the sausage really gets made in Washington, D.C. I mean, why haven't Republicans, other than Ron John and a few other conservative members, like screaming from the rooftops that the FBI hasn't provided their ballistics report and autopsy report, etc., from the first assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania? I mean, right now, Ron John says that the testimony suggests a bullet flew through Hercules 2, a sniper team, between the two snipers, right? So the sniper and the scouter, there's a bullet that went directly in between them. They did not have a line of sight to Crooks, and therefore Crooks did not have a line of sight to them. So that opens up a whole lot of questions. Was there a second shooter? What type of bullet was able to magically travel from Crooks to between the sniper team if there was not a clear line of sight? What are the potential influencers of any type of assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump, right? We saw with the second assassination attempt, that person was clearly deranged about what was happening, about what is happening in Ukraine. And we have zero answers. And if we don't have any of those answers by the time people go to cast their ballots on November 5th, I fear that those responsible, whether that's their government actors or foreign actors or lone wolf actors, will say, at the end of the day, we got what we wanted. President Trump did not get reelected, and therefore we have we weren't held to account. I have a lot of questions like why Kimberly Cheadle, the Secret Service or former Secret Service director, isn't in jail right now if security was this poor. It seems like it's a negligence, almost a criminal negligence, when you see how Ron John has broken down the exact timeline of all the different miscues and mistakes made by Secret Service in Butler, Pennsylvania that day. And that's not to condemn individual members of the Secret Service or law enforcement. It's to say that the administrative state is so comfortable with itself that no surprise whatsoever, competency continues to go down. And when competency goes down, the people who are on the front lines, those Secret Service agents are stress tested, right? They good jobs turn into bad jobs, and those bad jobs get even worse because they can't recruit the right agents, they can't get the right training, they don't have the right funding, etc. And so that I think is something that the American people need answers on immediately, and that Ron John is one of the only people right now singularly focused on that issue. If President Trump hadn't done what he did, if he hadn't acted like a hero that day, and if he wasn't with us at all, I think the situation could have been so much worse.
So you had a couple conversations coming up. What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, a couple conversations. Rick Scott is my next episode, and then we'll have Representative Andy Harris, who's the new Freedom Caucus chairman, as well as a few other episodes. And so this theme that we're going with to start this show, at least through November, is what does the right need to do to win, not only on November 5th, but in the fights immediately after. Rick Scott and I talk a lot about his bid to be the next Senate GOP leader. He talks to me about how the Senate, which he came here 6 years ago thinking it was, the most deliberative body in the world, is completely broken, and it's run effectively by two dictatorships. And he actually uses that word. It's the Schumer dictatorship and the McConnell dictatorship. And how do we restore normal order? Well, first, I think it comes with a change in leadership. And I think Rick Scott agrees with that. And I don't think any of the candidates running now would disagree that there needs to be some changes, at least, in how the Senate goes about its business. And so we get into his bid, we get into the Senate map and the Senate elections that could really move the needle in conservatives' favor. When we look at the Senate GOP conference, which, a lot of members say they're conservative, but let's look at their voting record. What does it suggest? I mean, it suggests that it's sold out conservatives. It's sold out the grassroots at every turn. So we talk about that a little bit. And then with Andy Harris, who is an appropriator, who's also the head of the House Freedom Caucus, we talk about this last Congress a little bit and how the House Freedom Caucus has really flexed its muscles, going all the way back to the original speaker fight between McCarthy and the 20, through replacing McCarthy with Johnson, up until this last continuing resolution fight. And so now the Freedom Caucus is in an interesting position where it's looking to expand its representation to districts where races are really close. They're purple districts through and through. And yet you could have very conservative members coming from those districts advocating for fiscal sanity in Congress. And that gives people like Andy Harris hope that their message is winning. But at the same time, they will be held to account by their voters 2 years from now if they do win those elections. So how do you balance, serving your district with working with your colleagues in the House Freedom Caucus and serving the ultimately what is the national interest, which is protecting the American dollar, protecting the government from going completely bankrupt, and therefore protecting all the American citizens who rely on that government, who rely on the reliability of our economy to live the good life. And another interesting thing about Andy Harris is I think Andy Harris will be a very, very different leader than Bob Good, who was atop the House Freedom Caucus until he stepped down recently, and because he lost his primary. He got primaried in his home state of Virginia, and he will not be returning to Congress. And Andy Harris kind of talks about the differences between how he would approach some issues. And that also brings Speaker Johnson into the picture, right, where Representative Good was very aggressive in his strategy to secure conservative victories. I think what you'll see is you'll see Representative Harris kind of take a step back from the limelight and kind of try to operate on the inside, right? Like try to get more conservatives represented on the Rules Committee, try to get more conservatives represented in appropriations, try to get more conservatives represented in all the various subcommittees that speak to these major issues that currently face the U.S. Congress. And with that personnel in place, maybe other conservatives who have been go along to get along actually will feel emboldened, right? Like in the episode with Andy Harris coming up, he has this great story about how when he got to Washington in 2011, they found a subsidy for $1 million a year for mohair that had been there since World War II. It's because no one had really been empowered to dig into the nitty gritty and find that government waste, find where we can reallocate dollars more effectively, find where we can be more responsible stewards of what is ultimately the American people's money and, of course, the American people's government. So he talks about that a little bit, and that is all to say that only is possible if the right people are in the right places at the right time in Washington, D.C. And he thinks that in this upcoming Congress, if things go Republicans' way, that conservatives could have a very outsized impact on all of the debates that have been so frustrating to conservatives over the last Congress.
You're a political reporter. You've been doing this for a while. Now you're having these conversations for Signal Sit Down, behind the scenes, really getting to know what's going on. Has this impacted your view of America at all? Or were you knew enough going in that it hasn't really affected you?
I think Donald Trump's utility has been showing exactly who these people, and I say these people as in the people in the elite, the people in the establishment, who these people really are, whether they're in the corporate media or whether they're in government. Maybe he wasn't able to drain the swamp in his first 4 years, but he definitely showed us where all the alligators are. And that is what I've learned the most about America through coming to DC and delving into how policy actually gets made here, is that it's not the regime you learn about in school. It's not the republic that the founders envisioned anymore. And that's in one way really blackpilling, right? Like you just kind of want to throw your hands up and give up and say the administrative state's too big. They have too much power. They have too many corporate cronies who want to censor me on social media. The World Economic Forum is once again saying that I should live in the pod, eat the bugs, and shut my mouth. That can be a blackpilling experience. But at the same time, the cool part is we all are in a position to recover that, to change that, to take it back. Because now we have the knowledge and the sight to say, oh, this has actually gone wrong. I don't think if Donald Trump doesn't come down that golden escalator in 2015, maybe things just keep going on as they were going on. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the heartland Americans get ignored, immigration continues to go up, jobs keep going overseas, wars continue to crop up all over the world, and we continue to fight all of them. And the Overton window has shifted. And so realizing the scope of the problem that America has right now shouldn't be something that's blackpilling. It should be, okay, now we all know what time it is, and now it's time to act. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do the Signal Sit Down. It was to connect two different media apparatuses. One is the national media, which focuses on the day-to-day politics, right? You think of your like Fox Newses or your New York Times. And then you have the kind of inside the beltway news outlets. You have your Punch Bowls and your Politicos, which is mostly for Washington, D.C. operators and folks who do their business in Washington, D.C. And we can connect those two things by having exactly the types of conversations we're having on the Signal Sit Down, which is we're going to give the grassroots what the inside baseball is. We're going to pull back the curtain and we're going to work together as a united front to hopefully save this country.
Bradley Devlin, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Bradley Devlin and to the Daily Signal for their contributions to this episode. You can find a link to the Signal Sit Down in the show notes. And of course, thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Heritage Explains is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. It's written and produced by Mark Guiney, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.